Handwriting experts have ruled out John Ramsey and others close to the family. They have not excluded Patsy Ramsey, who has submitted several samples. The ransom note analysis, however, doesn't end with handwriting. The detectives enlisted the help of this man, Professor Donald Foster of Vassar College.
Language, grammar, source material, borrowings, political or religious opinions, and anything that might enter into making a piece of writing distinctively one person's or another's.
I got nightmares in my head, I fear thoughts build up until I can't hear. My mind fills up into a creature, and it haunts me somewhere much deeper. I got nightmares in my head, I fear the thoughts build up until I can't hear. That my mind fills up into a creature, and it haunts me somewhere much deeper.
Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. I want you to imagine we are in the kitchen. It is sometime very late on Christmas Day or the day after Christmas, and irrespective of the identity of the person writing the ransom note, the pad is lying there, the pen, the Sharpie pen, is ready to be used. The page on which the note is going to be written is still blank. What is going on in that person's mind and heart that leads to the ransom note as we know it? What thoughts and feelings and psychologies are playing out that lead to the note being written the way it is? In effect, what inspired the ransom note? Not the content of it, but the idea of it. Of all the evidence found in the Ramsey home, the ransom note is by far the most deliberate and perhaps also the most painstaking and time-consuming. And yet it's so easy to get bogged down in the trees aspect, as we did for most of this year, examining individual letters and getting caught up in handwriting analysis. Not that that's not important. It's also tempting to take a too opposite perspective to the trees and only want to look at the woods. For example, the narrative surrounding the books in the Ramsey home. And we know that they were both, John and Patsy, voracious readers. And, so one can look at that, the other books that they were reading, what side of the bed was Mindhunter actually on, and how it appeared in crime scene photos and yet wasn't recorded in search warrants. But in this analysis, we're going to take a completely different woods and trees approach by making two crazy assumptions. Someone, or perhaps more than one someone inside the Ramsey home, wrote the note. That's one of the assumptions. And they used this book, one specific chapter, to guide their efforts. That's the other assumption. Now, what happens when we flesh out both of these assumptions? You might say, well, that's really crazy. I really don't believe that for a second. What happens when we breathe life, breathe fire into this idea? What happens when we simply look at that chapter that some said was a manual in how to commit a crime? What happens when we leave the note for a second, we put it aside, and we turn to chapter 16? While in the back of our minds we're aware that we are trying to figure out the psychology, to some extent the identity, but more importantly the thinking, the mental arithmetic, how this strategy seemed like a good strategy to its apparently intelligent authors.
Worth playing for?
Before we get to that, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do. Bear in mind I'm going to be doing a 3-part series on the JONBENET Ramsey case, live on the 23rd, the 24th, and Christmas Day. So look out for that. If you're enjoying this analysis, please like, share, leave a comment. You can also hit the thanks button, and let's get started. Number 1, the note inside the note. To ridicule the note or dismiss it is to miss its most crucial gift. It provides a glimpse into the criminal mind. You might say, well, of course it does. But what if the writer of the ransom note and the ransom note itself was trying to convince you of the criminal mind, taking his or her cue from a source beyond themselves, beyond their own imaginations, that was all about, so this source that they were using was all about revealing the criminal mind. Not movies, but scripts from a particular case in real life, taken from a particular chapter in a particular book. What if? Well, if this was the case, just like disguised handwriting analysis or handwriting from an ambidextrous individual, doing conventional analysis would only get you so far before tying you into the knots of the contrivance itself. You would end up going into a series of dead ends.
Foster identified the writer of the ransom note as Patsy Ramsey. Foster analyzed commonly used words and also found similarities between Patsy's letter format and that of the ransom note writers. The indentations and punctuation, especially the repeated use of the exclamation point.
But we're going to go even further than this. We're going to go to chapter 16, page 311 of the book Mindhunter. In the bottom third of page 311 of Mindhunter, the words "listen carefully" appear for the second time in that chapter. We'll deal with the context of the words in due course, but first, a few lines below "listen carefully," John Douglas notes, "He was getting bolder and cockier." I've explained that this analysis is about the psychology behind the ransom note, which is distinct from the motive or pure statement analysis or even handwriting analysis. It's the what and the how more than the why, and here is early confirmation for the tone of the ransom note, because the tone does become increasingly bold and cocky towards the end. Bold: if we catch you talking to a stray dog, she dies. Bold: be warned, we are familiar with law enforcement countermeasures and tactics. Cocky: don't try to grow a brain, John. Cocky: you are not the only fat cat around. Use that good southern common sense, John. Number 3, classical intertextuality. I often talk about intertextuality and then people say intertextuality is nothing new. Well, we're going to now deal with the nothing new aspect in intertextuality, where we simply look at the relationship between texts, right? And I talk about true crime intertextuality, which is different. It is the fabric of one case that resonates or is similar or is drawn from the fabric of another case. And so what we're going to deal with now is classic intertextuality, which is what you would do at school. You would look at how one text is intertextual to another. Because we are dealing with a crime here, we basically do want to look at two components: true crime intertextuality, and then there is intertextuality. This is a little bit of both, but let's start interrogating the 20 pages from a purely textual, as I say, text-based approach, and allow the psychology behind the note to brew in the background. You're not going to need to do any thinking. It's going to manifest of its own accord. The chapter we're looking at is titled "God Wants You to Join Shari Faye." Is there a reason this chapter resonated with the reader? In other words, the reader who then went on to write the ransom note. Someone who perhaps was thinking to herself, God wants you to join JONBENET. Page 298. Shari Faye Smith, a beautiful blah blah blah, was abducted blah 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 in front of her family's home blah 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 2 days before Shari was scheduled to sing the national anthem. Now I'm only highlighting certain apposite sentences and notions expressed in these pages. And so what we get is a beautiful young lady who disappears from her home, and she's also someone who participates not in pageants but or contests, but in these sort of performances. Shari's car was running, the door was open, her purse was lying on the seat. Panic-stricken, her father immediately called the cops. Now, you might say, I don't really get anything out of that, but the idea that the door is open kind of gives you a sense that something had just happened. Well, what happens in the Ramsey home? A window is open. Also, this idea of being panic-stricken, that's exactly what Patsy was. Did she get a sense of how she needs to act from this narrative. If you read that paragraph again and ask why it might resonate with a particular reader, why would it resonate with Patsy? Here's another sentence. How could this pretty, outgoing young blonde disappear from her own home, and what kind of person could be involved in such a thing? Imagine if you are the Ramseys and the idea is to cover up a crime, and you're confronted with a sentence like this. Let me read that again. How could this pretty, outgoing young blonde disappear from her own home, and what kind of person could be involved in such a thing? So how do you begin to manufacture someone? Well, this chapter is going to address that aspect. Now we go to page 299. The first thing the cops did was organize the largest manhunt in South Carolina history. The second thing was to quickly rule out as a suspect her father, Robert Smith, who had publicly begged for the return of his daughter. In any instance of a disappearance or possible crime against a low-risk victim, a spouse, parents, and close family members, they always have to be considered. This is all from page 299. The anguished Smith family waited for some word, any word, even a ransom demand. Well, this was the situation that was presented in the Ramsey home after the police arrived, waiting for something to happen, waiting for the phone to ring. The next line on page 299, then they got a phone call. And what was said over the phone was, so you'll know this isn't a hoax. And then the abductor described Sherry's clothing. That brings us to number 4, time intertextuality. The caller made no ransom demand saying, you'll get a letter later today. Not later today. In the Ramsey case, you had it the other way around. A letter promising a call. This is quoting from the Ramsey ransom note. I will call you between 8 and 10 a.m. tomorrow to instruct you on delivery. Why couldn't he instruct on the delivery in the note? It's long enough. So the today-tomorrow thing is interesting because 27 years later, it's still not clear whether JONBENET died very late on Christmas night or very early on the day after Christmas. And I guess that might be deliberate as well. The date on her grave suggests the former, but is that accurate or is it purposefully misleading? The scream heard after midnight by neighbor Melody Stanton suggests the latter, that JONBENET died early on the 26th. If Patsy did write the note and if she was up all night writing it and researching how to do it, one can imagine she above all would want to follow the advice that's in the note itself. I advise you to be rested. And if the call and delivery was going to happen tomorrow, well then that would be offering a little bit of time to do that. Can you see how we are navigating through areas of potential psychology? All of this is speculative naturally, but it's speculative within the anchors of, first of all, the ransom note and then aspects from this chapter, from Mindhunter. We're simply navigating and trying to see how likely this possibility is. We're trying to navigating through the hidden psychology behind the note, which is something you very rarely see, rather than the note itself. Going back to page, 299, FBI agents Jim Wright and Ron Walker, does that name ring a bell? They were called in terms of this case. John Douglas actually was called as well, but was unavailable. And they were called to analyze the circumstances. This is of the Sherry Faye case. They were supposed to look at photos of the scene. They were supposed to look at reports of the telephone call. And so obviously, again, someone reading this chapter would be aware of how much attention police pay to a phone call, to what is said as well, to the details of a phone call. And if anything, I would hazard a guess that Patsy was too hasty in cutting off the dispatcher and at the same time possibly miscradling the phone. That error, if that is what happened, that could have actually torpedoed the case then and there. If she had done even worse job of not cradling the phone, perhaps quite a lot more could have been overheard. Anyway, let's go on. Number 5, tone intertextuality. Taking its cue from this, sophisticated and dangerous, 2 words that appear in that chapter of Mindhunter, the ransom note sounds very like a dangerous situation. From the ransom note, dangerous. Any deviation of my instructions will result in the immediate execution of your daughter. You'll also be denied her remains for a proper burial. Speaking to anyone about your situation, such as the police or FBI, will result in your daughter, blah, blah, blah. Dangerous, right? Now sophisticated. Make sure that you bring an adequate size attaché to the bank. If we monitor you getting the money early, we might call you early. You and your family are under constant scrutiny, as well as the authorities, right? It speaks of a sophisticated perpetrator. And here's dangerous and sophisticated. You stand a 99% chance of getting your daughter into trouble if you try to outsmart us. It's also interesting how the writer refers to herself or himself repeatedly in the plural form us. Was that in effect a reference to an actual faction? The us is a faction of people? Was it a reference to Patsy and John, albeit perhaps subconscious? Or is that Gary Oliver writing in a fantastical way? And now we go to number 6, situational intertextualities. This is again from that chapter. They were afraid the subject was already dead. The Sharifeh case was about a ransom demand for someone who was already dead, and the JONBENET Ramsey case the same. To say it was stupid of the intruder to write a note and leave the body misses the point. The point is to abracadabra a phantom intruder in the first place. Even if you're going to make the case that he doesn't exist or that the note is absurd, you're already moving away from making the case for what did happen. And in a way, that is what this analysis is trying to do. Say, okay, all those things about the note that don't make sense, what is likely the case that led to the note existing to begin with? Where was that drawn from? What did likely happen in terms of the construction, the inspiration of the note itself? Now we go to page 300. The Sheriff's Department set up recording equipment in the Smith home in the hopes of further communication. That then brings us to intertextualities of scope and scale. Then came a critical and extremely distressing piece of evidence. It was a 2-page handwritten letter to the family. The ransom note was 3 pages, but really it was 2 pages and a bit. Simply in terms of the length of the ransom note, who decided that? What decided that? Where did the inspiration come from to write a 2-page and a bit note? Well, wasn't it from this page, top of page 300, from chapter 16 of this book, from Mindhunter? You might say, I don't think you know what this is getting at. This was written by blah, blah, blah. But what if you were reading this and you were flustered and you were reading it quickly and you were quickly taking notes and you saw the words 2-page note? So I'm not going to take it further than that. Of the approximately 20 pages from Douglas's 16th chapter from Mindhunter, we've barely scratched the surface of the first 2 pages and a bit from that chapter. Do you want me to go on? Are you already picking up psychological cues in this narrative that if someone in the Ramsey home did know about it, right, did know about the book, did know about this chapter, and did refer to it in some way, would that have been a kind of a manual in how to turn a crime of whatever sort it originally was, and the imminent investigation that was about to stampede through the Ramsey home into a kind of pageant of reality, a pageant of reality rather than reality itself, where a scenario is duplicated, researched, rehearsed, and just like a pageant, then presented to an impending audience. What do you think? Thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.